Have you ever wondered how 13 small colonies, clinging to the edge of a vast continent, rose to become one of the most powerful nations in the world? The history of the United States is not just a timeline of dates and battles. It's a story of people, ideas, and struggles that shaped a nation from the ground up. From colonial beginnings under foreign empires, to a fight for independence, to civil wars and world wars, to technological revolutions that changed the planet, America's story is one of constant reinvention. And here's the best part. If you stay until the end, you'll see how this journey from fragile beginnings to global power still echoes in the America we know today. What if I told you that the United States almost never existed? Imagine a world where a handful of European empires fought endlessly over a stretch of land that seemed small compared to their global ambitions. At first, North America was just another piece in a giant chess game between powers like Spain, France, and Britain. Yet this land, filled with forests, rivers, and boundless potential, would soon become the stage for a revolution that changed history. Britain slowly rose as the strongest power in this struggle. By the mid-1700s, its colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, from Massachusetts down to Georgia. But life in the colonies was not free. London demanded loyalty, obedience, and above all, taxes. The colonists were expected to follow Britain's rules without having any real voice in how those rules were made. At first, these demands seemed like business as usual. But then new taxes piled up, on tea, paper, and even basic goods. Colonists began to wonder, why should they pay for an empire that treated them as subjects, not citizens? That simple question planted the seeds of rebellion. This is where the true story of America begins, with a clash between a mighty empire and a restless people who believed they deserved more. And if you stay with me until the very end of this video, you'll see how those seeds of resistance grew into a powerful nation that would shape the modern world. The tension between Britain and the colonies didn't explode overnight. It built slowly, like a storm on the horizon. Every new tax, every new restriction felt like another insult. Then came moments that shocked the colonies awake. The Boston Massacre, where British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing civilians. Where the Boston Tea Party, where angry colonists dumped tea into the harbor to defy the king's authority. These were not just protests. They were warnings. By 1776, the call for independence was too strong to ignore. Leaders like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin gathered to write a bold declaration. Its message was simple but powerful: all men are created equal, and government exists only with the consent of the people. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence was signed. For the first time, the colonies dared to say out loud, they were no longer subjects of Britain. They were Americans. But words alone could not secure freedom. Britain sent its armies across the ocean to crush the rebellion. The war that followed was brutal and uncertain. American soldiers, poorly supplied and often outnumbered, fought against one of the most powerful militaries in the world. Yet their determination carried them through. With the crucial help of France, the tide slowly turned. Battles like Saratoga and Yorktown proved that victory was possible. Finally, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The United States of America was born. A fragile, young nation stood on its own, free but untested. The revolution was over, but the real challenge was only beginning: how to govern themselves. Winning independence was only half the battle. Now the young United States faced an even greater question: how do you govern a brand new country? At first, the answer was the Articles of Confederation. It gave each state a lot of power and left the central government weak. But it didn't work. The government couldn't raise taxes, couldn't regulate trade, and couldn't even enforce its own laws. The new nation was free. But it was fragile. Leaders realized something stronger was needed. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to write a new framework, the Constitution. It was revolutionary in its own way. Power would be divided into three branches: the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. Each would balance the others so no one could rule unchecked. To protect individual freedoms, the Bill of Rights was added soon after. This was more than paperwork. It was a blueprint for a new kind of nation, one built not on kings and titles, but on laws and representation. Under leaders like George Washington, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson, the United States began to grow. The capital was built, new states were added, and the idea of America started to take shape. But even in these early years, deep tensions lingered. Questions of slavery, expansion, and power between the states and the federal government never fully went away. They were problems waiting to erupt. As the 1800s began, America was eager to grow. In 1803, the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the nation almost overnight. Vast new lands stretched westward, promising opportunity, adventure, and wealth. The dream of manifest destiny, the belief that America was meant to expand from coast to coast, took hold of the people's imagination. Pioneers pushed west, carving trails through mountains and rivers. New inventions like the steamboat and the cotton gin fueled economic growth. Railroads and canals connected distant regions, helping trade flourish. The North developed factories and industries, while the South relied heavily on agriculture, especially cotton worked by enslaved people. This difference between North and South was more than just economic. It was cultural, political, and moral. The question of slavery divided the nation. Some argued it was necessary for prosperity. Others saw it as a stain on the nation's ideals of freedom and equality. Each new state added to the Union became a battleground over whether it would allow slavery or not. By the mid-1800s, tensions reached a breaking point. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. He opposed the spread of slavery, and Southern states saw his victory as a threat to their way of life. One by one, they seceded from the Union. The United States was no longer united. The stage was set for the bloodiest conflict in its history, the Civil War. The nation finally broke apart in 1861. When Confederate guns fired on Fort Sumter, the Civil War began. What followed was 4 years of brutal fighting between North and South. At first, many believed it would be a short war. But battles like Bull Run, Antietam, and Gettysburg proved otherwise. The war became a test of endurance. The North had more factories, more railroads, and a larger population. The South had strong generals, deep loyalty, and the determination to defend their land. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free. The war was no longer just about preserving the Union, it was also about ending slavery. For many, this gave the fight a higher purpose. But the cost was staggering. Families were torn apart. Cities were burned. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died. The turning point came when Union forces, led by Ulysses S. Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman, pushed deep into the South. Victory at Vicksburg gave the North control of the Mississippi River, while Sherman's march to the sea crushed Southern morale. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. The Union was saved. Slavery was abolished. But just days later, Lincoln was assassinated. His death left the country grieving at the very moment it needed unity most. The Civil War had ended. But the scars it left behind would shape America for generations. The next challenge was clear: how to rebuild a nation that had nearly destroyed itself. After the Civil War, America entered a new chapter. The nation had survived, but it needed to heal and rebuild. This period, known as Reconstruction, tried to bring the South back into the Union and give freedom a real meaning for millions of formerly enslaved people. But progress was uneven, and tensions between races and regions remained. At the same time, the country began to grow at a speed never seen before. Railroads spread across the continent, linking east to west. Steel, coal, and oil fueled new industries. Immigrants arrived in huge numbers, searching for work and opportunity. Cities swelled with factories, workshops, and crowded neighborhoods. This was the age of invention and ambition. The telephone, the light bulb, and the typewriter transformed daily life. Giants of business like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller built fortunes that changed the economy forever. America was no longer just a nation finding its feet. It was becoming a modern powerhouse. But rapid growth came with problems. Workers faced long hours and low pay. Children toiled in factories. Poor families lived in cramped, unsafe housing. Strikes and protests erupted as people demanded fair treatment. The gap between the rich and poor grew wider, and many wondered if the promise of America was being shared fairly. Still, by the end of the 1800s, the United States had risen to stand among the world's great powers. It was a country bursting with energy, invention, and ambition, ready to step onto the global stage. By the early 1900s, America had transformed into an industrial giant. Its factories, railroads, and cities signaled strength and confidence. But the nation was about to be tested on the world stage. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States at first stayed neutral. Yet by 1917, German submarine attacks and a threat to American security pushed the country into the war. Millions of U.S. soldiers crossed the Atlantic, and their arrival gave the Allies a decisive edge. When the war ended in 1918, America had proven itself as a rising global power. The 1920s brought a wave of change. Known as the Roaring Twenties, this decade saw jazz music, radio broadcasts, Hollywood films, and booming consumer culture. Automobiles rolled off assembly lines, and new technologies reached everyday homes. But beneath the glamour, not all was stable. The stock market crashed in 1929, plunging the country into the Great Depression. Millions lost jobs, banks collapsed, and breadlines stretched through city streets. It would take another global conflict to lift America out of despair. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States entered World War II. Factories roared back to life, producing weapons and supplies. Soldiers fought across Europe and the Pacific. In 1945, victory was declared. But at a terrible cost. The world had witnessed the atomic bomb for the first time, dropped by the United States on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the end of the war, America stood as one of two superpowers. The world had changed forever. And so had the role of the United States. When World War II ended, a new kind of conflict began. It wasn't fought on battlefields with armies facing each other. It was fought with ideas, technology, and influence. This was the Cold War, an intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both nations built massive stockpiles of nuclear weapons. Each side tried to outmatch the other in science and technology. The space race captured the world's imagination, with the Soviet Union launching the first satellite, Sputnik, and America landing the first men on the moon in 1969. At home, America was also fighting another battle, this one within its own borders. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s demanded an end to segregation and racial injustice. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. inspired millions to march, protest, and push the country closer to its founding promise of equality. But not everything was triumph. The Vietnam War dragged on through the 1960s and early 1970s, dividing the nation. Many questioned whether America should be fighting so far from home. Protests filled the streets, and the war left the country scarred and uncertain. Still, through all the turmoil, the United States remained strong. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the Cold War was over. America was left standing as the world's sole superpower, its influence reaching every corner of the globe. With the Cold War over, the United States entered the 1990s as the world's leading power. The economy surged, driven by new technology. The rise of personal computers and the internet transformed daily life. A new digital age was beginning, and America was at its center. But the new century brought new challenges. On September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. shocked the world. The Twin Towers fell, and thousands lost their lives. In response, the United States launched the War on Terror, fighting in Afghanistan and later in Iraq. These wars would shape foreign policy for decades. At home, the country faced other trials. The financial crisis of 2008 triggered deep recession and uncertainty. Political divisions widened, and debates over healthcare, immigration, and social justice intensified. Technology continued to change how people worked, lived, and connected. And it also brought new struggles, misinformation, polarization, and economic inequality. Still, the American story has always been one of resilience. From colonies under British rule to the present day, the United States has reinvented itself again and again. Its history is filled with conflict, progress, setbacks, and triumphs. And its future, just like its past, will be shaped by the choices of its people. The history of America is not finished, it is still being written today. The story of the United States is not a straight line. It is a journey filled with struggles and triumphs, setbacks and breakthroughs. From a handful of colonies fighting for survival, to a nation that leads on the world stage, America has been defined by one constant: the drive to reinvent itself. And the truth is, the story isn't over. Every challenge today, every debate, every dream, is part of the next chapter in America's history. What happens tomorrow will one day be remembered alongside the Revolution, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement. The future is still being written. If you've made it this far, you've traveled through centuries of history with me, and I want to thank you. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who love history. That way you won't miss the next deep dive into the past. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about what we learn, and how it shapes the world we live in today.